A quiet Tuesday evening in Harlem turned into a declaration of war. Bumpy Johnson's daughter sat in Red Rooster, enjoying dinner with friends, when 4 men in dark suits stormed through the entrance. What happened next would remind everyone in New York that some families you simply don't touch. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your location below. And if this story hooks you, hit that subscribe button, because respect and revenge make unforgettable history. The year was 1962, and Red Rooster on Lenox Avenue stood as one of Harlem's finest establishments. White tablecloths, jazz drifting from the corner stage, the scent of bourbon and seared steak filling the air. This wasn't some back alley joint. This was where Harlem's elite gathered, where doctors sat beside numbers runners, where money talked louder than skin color. Ruthie Johnson had chosen a corner table, her back to the silk-papered wall. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from being Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's only daughter. She wore a navy dress, pearl earrings, her hair styled in the fashion of the day. 3 friends accompanied her, all young women from respectable Harlem families, celebrating a birthday with laughter and expensive wine. The evening had unfolded without incident until 8:30. That's when the front door swung open with enough force to silence the piano player mid-note. 4 white men entered, their movements sharp and purposeful. Dark suits, polished shoes, the telltale bulge of shoulder holsters beneath their jackets. They weren't customers. They were the mayor's personal security detail, and they moved through Red Rooster like they owned every inch of it. The head guard, a thick-necked man named Patrick Sullivan, scanned the room with cold eyes. His gaze settled on Ruthie's table and held there. He spoke briefly to his companions, then crossed the restaurant floor in long strides. Conversations died in his wake. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Everyone in that room understood when trouble arrived, dressed in authority. Sullivan reached Ruthie's table and didn't bother with pleasantries. His voice carried across the now silent restaurant. The mayor would be arriving in 10 minutes for a private dinner. This section needed to be cleared. All of it. These girls needed to settle their bill and leave immediately. Ruthie looked up at him with her father's eyes. She spoke calmly, her voice steady. They had a reservation. They'd ordered their meals. They weren't sitting in a private section. They had every right to finish their dinner. Sullivan's face darkened. He wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no, especially not from a young black woman in a Harlem restaurant. He leaned down, placing both palms flat on the white tablecloth, his face inches from Ruthie's. His breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes. He repeated himself, slower this time, each word weighted with threat. They could leave on their own, or his men would assist them. Either way, they'd be gone in 2 minutes. The restaurant owner, a thin man named Marcus Webb, hurried over from the bar. His hands shook as he tried to negotiate, offering to move the ladies to another table, to comp their entire meal. Sullivan cut him off with a look that promised consequences if he spoke another word. Ruthie remained seated. She knew who she was. More importantly, she knew who her father was. In Harlem, that meant something. It meant protection. It meant respect. It meant men in suits didn't put their hands on you in public establishments, no matter whose authority they claimed. Sullivan straightened and gestured to his men. What happened next would be recounted in Harlem barbershops and beauty parlors for decades. 2 guards moved to Ruthie's sides. They grabbed her by the upper arms and physically lifted her from her chair. Her wine glass toppled, red spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Her friends cried out in protest, but the other guards blocked them with raised hands and hard stares. They walked Ruthie toward the door, her feet barely touching the ground. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She kept her dignity even as they stripped her of respect. The entire restaurant watched in frozen silence as Bumpy Johnson's daughter was removed like common trash. They deposited her on the sidewalk outside, Sullivan's final words following her into the night. Next time, show some respect when authority speaks. The door closed. Inside, the mayor's party arrived 5 minutes later to a prepared table and a restaurant full of witnesses who would never forget what they'd seen. Outside, Ruthie stood on Lenox Avenue, straightening her dress with trembling hands. One of her friends rushed out to join her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Ruthie spoke 4 words into the cooling evening air. Her voice was quiet, but certain. Someone needed to tell her father. Within an hour, 3 different people had delivered the news to Bumpy Johnson. Each one described the scene in vivid detail. The disrespect, the public humiliation, the way Sullivan's men had put their hands on his daughter like she was nothing. Bumpy listened to each account without interruption. His face revealed nothing, but everyone who knew him recognized the stillness that came over him. It was the quiet before a storm that would reshape the landscape of power in Harlem. The guards had made their choice when they walked into Red Rooster. Now Bumpy Johnson would make his Ellsworth Raymond Johnson earned the nickname Bumpy from a massive cyst on the back of his head, a physical mark that somehow became synonymous with power in Harlem. By 1962, he had spent 4 decades building an empire that existed in the shadows between legal business and organized crime. He wasn't the flashiest gangster in New York, but he was arguably the smartest, and certainly the most respected, north of 110th Street. Bumpy had arrived in Harlem from South Carolina in 1919, a skinny teenager with angry eyes and quick fists. The neighborhood swallowed boys like him whole, but Bumpy refused to be consumed. He started running numbers for local operators, proving himself reliable in a business where reliability meant everything. He didn't steal from the count. He didn't skim off the top. He showed up when he said he would. And he kept his mouth shut when the police came asking questions. By the 1930s, Bumpy had attracted the attention of Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queenie who controlled Harlem's numbers racket. She recognized something in him that others missed. He had discipline. He understood that respect carried more weight than fear, and that calculated moves beat impulsive violence every time. Under her mentorship, Bumpy refined his approach to power. He learned that the best gangsters weren't the ones who shot first, but the ones who made shooting unnecessary. Bumpy's relationship with the Italian mob was complicated and legendary. While other black operators got muscled out or killed when the mafia pushed into Harlem, Bumpy negotiated. He formed an alliance with Lucky Luciano that recognized certain territories as black-controlled while cooperating on larger operations. It was an arrangement built on mutual benefit rather than submission, and it required a particular kind of intelligence to maintain. Bumpy walked that tightrope for years, respected by men who typically respected no one outside their own families. Prison had been a recurring interruption in Bumpy's life. He served multiple stretches in Sing Sing and Alcatraz, mostly for drug-related charges. But even behind bars, his reputation grew. He befriended a young Malcolm X during one stint, and their conversations about race, power, and dignity would influence both men for years to come. Bumpy read voraciously in prison, educating himself in philosophy, history, and law. He emerged from each sentence sharper than when he entered. What set Bumpy apart from other criminals wasn't just his business acumen. It was his relationship with the Harlem community. While he ran illegal operations, he also functioned as a neighborhood protector. He funded local businesses when banks refused them loans. He paid rent for families facing eviction. He made sure elderly residents had coal for heat during brutal winters. When white-owned stores in Harlem refused to hire black employees, Bumpy paid them visits that resulted in immediate policy changes. The people of Harlem understood the contradictions in Bumpy Johnson. He was a criminal who made the neighborhood safer. He ran gambling operations that the police ignored, yet he violently discouraged drug dealers from setting up near schools. He commanded an organization built on breaking laws. But he enforced a moral code within his territory that was stricter than anything the Nip managed. His family life remained largely private, a deliberate separation from his street business. Bumpy's wife, Mame, was a woman of quiet strength who managed their household and knew exactly what her husband did for a living. She accepted it without illusion, understanding that the money paying for their comfortable home came from numbers, protection, and worse. But she also saw the man behind the reputation, the one who read poetry and treated her with unfailing respect. Ruthie was Bumpy's universe in ways that his criminal empire never could be. He had raised her with clear boundaries between his world and hers. She attended good schools. She dressed well. She moved in circles that included legitimate business people and professionals. Bumpy wanted her to have choices he never had, opportunities that his criminal record would forever deny him. She was his chance at redemption, proof that something good could come from a life built in shadows. The relationship between father and daughter was tender in ways that would surprise anyone who only knew Bumpy's reputation. He attended her school plays. He taught her to play chess, emphasizing strategy and thinking 3 moves ahead. He never raised his voice to her, never brought his street business into conversations at the dinner table. When she asked about what he did, he answered honestly, but without detail. She knew enough to understand, but not enough to be implicated. Bumpy had made enemies over the decades. Rival operators who resented his success. Corrupt cops who wanted bigger payoffs. Politicians who saw him as a convenient scapegoat when crime statistics needed explaining. But there was an unwritten rule that even his enemies respected. You didn't touch a man's family. You didn't bring wives and children into business disputes. It was a line that separated criminals from monsters, and crossing it invited consequences that had nothing to do with profit or territory. That code meant everything to men like Bumpy. It was the foundation of honor in a dishonorable business. A man's reputation rested on his ability to protect his own, to respond appropriately when respect was violated. Failing to act when your family was disrespected didn't just damage your standing. It invited further attacks. It announced weakness. In Harlem's power structure, weakness was a death sentence. When word reached Bumpy about what happened at Red Rooster, he faced a test of everything he had built. The guards who grabbed Ruthie didn't just insult his daughter. They challenged his entire position in Harlem. They announced to everyone watching that Bumpy Johnson's protection meant nothing when set against the mayor's authority. They forced him into a corner where doing nothing meant accepting that his family was vulnerable, that his power was an illusion. Bumpy had spent his life avoiding unnecessary violence. He preferred negotiation, strategic pressure, solutions that didn't leave bodies in the street. But this situation offered no room for negotiation. The disrespect was public. The humiliation was witnessed by dozens of people who would spread the story across Harlem within hours. Sullivan and his men had guaranteed that whatever came next, it would need to be equally public, equally undeniable. The man who sat in his apartment that night, listening to the details of his daughter's treatment, wasn't just a father. He was a symbol of black power in a neighborhood that had precious little of it. Every eye in Harlem would be watching his response. Every criminal, every politician, every ordinary citizen would measure him by what happened next. The guards had thrown down a challenge that Bumpy Johnson couldn't ignore, even if he wanted to. His reputation, his business, his family's safety, all of it depended on what he did in the coming days. Harlem in 1962 existed under a complex web of power that outsiders rarely understood. On the surface, city officials and police held authority. Beneath that, organized crime controlled entire industries. And woven through both layers was a network of influence that determined who prospered and who disappeared. The mayor's office sat at the center of this arrangement, benefiting from relationships with criminals while publicly condemning the very activities that filled unofficial campaign coffers. Mayor Robert Wagner, Jr. ran New York with a political machine that depended on calculated compromises. His administration maintained partnerships with various mob factions, accepting their financial support during elections while allowing them operational freedom in certain neighborhoods. It was corruption, dressed in pragmatism, justified by the argument that someone would run illegal gambling and vice regardless, so it might as well be organized criminals who understood the value of political contributions. The guards who worked as the mayor's personal security detail occupied a unique position in this structure. They weren't regular NIPTY officers bound by departmental rules and oversight. They were hand-picked men loyal to Wagner personally, operating with authority that existed in the gray area between official law enforcement and private muscle. Patrick Sullivan had worked for the mayor for 6 years, and he'd learned that his badge carried weight beyond what the law technically allowed. Sullivan and his team understood their role. They protected the mayor from physical threats, but they also insulated him from uncomfortable situations. When Wagner needed a union organizer pressured, Sullivan made quiet visits. When campaign donors required favorable police responses to complaints, Sullivan facilitated arrangements. When the mayor wanted to dine without rubbing shoulders with Harlem residents in their own neighborhood establishments, Sullivan cleared rooms without asking permission. This arrangement had functioned smoothly because most people in Harlem understood the cost of resistance. Fighting the mayor's office meant fighting City Hall, which meant fighting a system designed to crush individual opposition. Business owners who complained about shakedowns lost their licenses. Residents who reported abuse found themselves facing retaliatory investigations. The message was clear and consistently enforced. You could hate the system privately, but you accommodated it publicly. Bumpy Johnson existed outside this conventional power structure, which made him both valuable and dangerous to city officials. He controlled criminal operations that the mayor's office couldn't directly manage, but he also commanded loyalty in Harlem that no elected official could match. Politicians needed Bumpy's cooperation during elections to ensure certain neighborhoods voted correctly or stayed home entirely. In return, police raids on his operations came with advance warning, and prosecutions moved slowly through deliberately incompetent investigations. The relationship between Bumpy and City Hall was transactional, rather than friendly. Wagner's administration tolerated Bumpy because he maintained order in areas where official authority struggled. Bumpy tolerated the mayor because direct conflict with government power rarely ended well, even for someone with his resources. They circled each other carefully, maintaining balance through mutual benefit rather than trust. But this balance depended on respect for boundaries. City officials didn't interfere with Bumpy's core operations or his family. Bumpy didn't challenge the mayor's public authority or expose the corruption that kept the machine running. Both sides understood that violating these boundaries would collapse the entire arrangement, forcing a confrontation that neither could afford. Sullivan's decision to physically remove Ruthie Johnson from Red Rooster shattered this understanding. Whether he acted on direct orders from the mayor or on his own initiative became irrelevant the moment his hands touched Bumpy's daughter. He had crossed a line that existed for specific reasons, turning a manageable arrangement into a personal vendetta that couldn't be resolved through backroom negotiations. The incident exposed something fundamental about power in 1960s New York. Official authority could intimidate most people, but it couldn't protect everyone from consequences. Sullivan believed his position made him untouchable, that the mayor's backing insulated him from retaliation regardless of whose daughter he manhandled. He failed to understand that Bumpy's power operated in spaces where badges and political connections meant nothing. Harlem's residents recognized what was happening before City Hall did. The story of Ruthie's removal spread through the neighborhood within hours, carried by restaurant workers, street vendors, and everyone who understood its implications. This wasn't just gossip about a gangster's daughter getting disrespected. It was a test of whether black power meant anything when confronted by white authority, even in a predominantly black neighborhood. Community leaders watched Bumpy's response carefully. Ministers who condemned his criminal activities still recognized him as a protector of Harlem's interests. Business owners who had never spoken to him directly understood that his reputation kept certain predators away from their establishments. Even residents who wanted nothing to do with the underworld acknowledged that Bumpy represented something important. The idea that black people in Harlem didn't have to accept every humiliation that white authority decided to inflict. The mayor's office initially dismissed the incident as a minor confrontation blown out of proportion. Wagner's advisors assured him that clearing a restaurant for his security wasn't unprecedented or problematic. They failed to grasp that this particular restaurant clearing involved this particular family, creating a situation that required immediate damage control rather than bureaucratic dismissal. Bumpy's network began gathering information within hours of the incident. He had people throughout the city who owed him favors or feared his displeasure. Within 2 days, he knew Sullivan's home address, his wife's name, his children's schools, his regular routes, and his off-duty habits. He knew which bars Sullivan frequented, which mistress he visited on Thursday evenings, and which of his fellow guards he trusted completely, versus which ones he merely supervised. This intelligence gathering served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Bumpy's reach to anyone paying attention. It reminded City Hall that their security detail wasn't as protected as they assumed. And it gave Bumpy options for how to respond, ranging from direct confrontation to more subtle demonstrations of his capabilities. The political calculations grew complicated quickly. Wagner couldn't afford to appear weak by punishing his own guards for doing their job, even if that job was executed poorly. But he also couldn't afford open warfare with Bumpy Johnson, which would expose the corrupt arrangements that kept his administration functioning. He needed a solution that preserved his authority while avoiding escalation. Bumpy faced his own political considerations. Going after the mayor's guards meant challenging government power directly, inviting federal attention that his local arrangements couldn't deflect. But backing down meant accepting that his family was vulnerable, that his protection extended only as far as City Hall allowed. Every criminal operator in New York would be watching to see if Bumpy Johnson had become too old, too cautious, too afraid of consequences to defend his own daughter. The power structure that had maintained stability in Harlem for years suddenly became unstable. Both sides understood that whatever happened next would reset the boundaries between official authority and criminal power. Sullivan's actions had created a situation where someone had to lose face publicly, and neither Bumpy nor the mayor's office could afford to be that someone. Harlem waited. The streets buzzed with speculation about what Bumpy would do, how the mayor would respond, whether this would end in violence or negotiation. The neighborhood had seen power struggles before, but this one felt different. This one was personal in ways that made compromise difficult, and retaliation almost inevitable. Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue for 3 days, receiving visitors in a steady stream that continued from morning until late evening. Associates arrived with information. Community leaders came offering support or counsel. Old friends from his prison days stopped by to remind him they stood ready if needed. Each visitor found Bumpy in the same position, seated in his leather chair by the window, listening more than speaking, his face revealing nothing about the calculations happening behind his eyes. Mame Johnson watched her husband during those 3 days and recognized the pattern. He was working through scenarios, testing strategies in his mind the way he tested chess moves before committing to them on the board. She had seen this before, during conflicts with rival operators or negotiations with the Italian families. Bumpy never acted on anger alone. He channeled rage into planning, transforming emotion into strategy until his response carried maximum impact with minimum waste. Ruthie stayed with relatives in Brooklyn, removed from Harlem until the situation resolved itself. Bumpy had insisted on this immediately after hearing about the restaurant incident. His daughter argued that leaving made her look weak, made him look unable to protect his own family in his own neighborhood. He had explained patiently that her safety mattered more than appearances, and that what he planned to do worked better with her away from potential retaliation. The first decision Bumpy made was to avoid direct violence against Sullivan. Killing a member of the mayor's security detail would bring consequences that even his political connections couldn't manage. Federal investigators would flood Harlem. The FBI would have justification to dismantle his entire operation. Every arrangement he'd built with city officials would collapse under the weight of a murdered guard. The satisfaction of putting a bullet in Sullivan's head wasn't worth destroying everything he'd constructed over 4 decades. But Sullivan needed to understand what he'd done. He needed to feel vulnerable in ways that his badge and political backing couldn't prevent. He needed to lose sleep, to question his safety, to realize that authority only protected him within certain boundaries. Bumpy wanted Sullivan to live with fear the way Ruthie would live with the memory of being dragged from that restaurant. Bumpy's second decision involved the mayor's office directly. Wagner needed to understand that tolerating disrespect toward Bumpy's family changed their arrangement fundamentally. The mayor benefited from Bumpy's cooperation during elections, from his ability to keep Harlem's criminal element organized and relatively quiet. That cooperation wasn't unconditional, and Wagner needed reminding that Bumpy's goodwill carried value worth protecting. The planning required careful coordination with multiple parties. Bumpy reached out to his contacts in the Italian families, explaining the situation and requesting they stay neutral in whatever came next. He wasn't asking for their help, just their non-interference. The Italians respected family matters, understood that a man had to respond when his daughter was disrespected. They agreed to watch from the sidelines, curious to see how Bumpy would handle a conflict with City Hall. He consulted with his lawyer, a sharp Jewish attorney named David Steinberg, who specialized in criminal defense and understood the intersection of street power and legal maneuvering. Steinberg advised caution, warning that anything too visible would give prosecutors ammunition they'd been seeking for years. But he also acknowledged that doing nothing would damage Bumpy's position beyond repair. They discussed options that delivered impact while maintaining plausible deniability. Bumpy's network began making subtle moves throughout the city. Bribes that normally flowed to certain police precincts slowed to a trickle. Information about upcoming crimes that Bumpy usually traded for favorable treatment suddenly became unavailable. Union cooperation on city projects that depended on Bumpy's influence with certain labor leaders started experiencing unexpected complications. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be traced directly to the restaurant incident, but enough friction to remind Wagner's administration what Bumpy's cooperation was worth. Meanwhile, Sullivan's life began experiencing strange disruptions. His car was towed 3 times in 1 week, each time legally, but inconveniently. Traffic tickets appeared on his windshield for violations that may or may not have occurred. His favorite lunch spot ran out of food whenever he arrived. Small things, irritating things, the kind of petty harassment that couldn't be proven or prosecuted, but accumulated into constant aggravation. Sullivan's fellow guards started receiving anonymous calls at home, late at night. Nobody on the line when they answered. Their wives began noticing cars parked on their streets that didn't belong to neighbors. One guard found his daughter's school schedule tucked under his windshield wiper with no note attached, just the schedule. A message that needed no words to communicate its meaning. Bumpy was applying pressure systematically, demonstrating reach without committing acts that could be prosecuted. He was showing the mayor's security detail that their authority extended only as far as their badges protected them, and badges meant nothing when you were off duty, at home, surrounded by family who could be reached as easily as Ruthie had been reached. Through intermediaries, Bumpy sent a message to Wagner's office. The communication was indirect, delivered through a city councilman who owed Bumpy favors and maintained good relations with the mayor. The message was simple. The arrangement between Bumpy's organization and City Hall had functioned smoothly for years because both sides respected certain boundaries. Those boundaries had been violated. The violation required acknowledgement and correction, or the arrangement would need renegotiation under less favorable terms. Wagner's response came through the same councilman 3 days later. The mayor expressed regret about the restaurant incident, claimed Sullivan had exceeded his authority, and suggested that disciplinary action was being considered internally. It was the kind of non-apology that politicians specialized in, acknowledging a problem without accepting responsibility or promising meaningful consequences. Bumpy rejected this response immediately. Internal disciplinary action meant nothing to him. Sullivan would receive a reprimand in his file, maybe a week's suspension, and return to work with his authority intact. That outcome announced to everyone in Harlem that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson's family carried no real consequences if you had the right political connections. The negotiations continued for another week, growing increasingly tense as both sides recognized that compromise was becoming impossible. Wagner couldn't fire Sullivan without appearing weak, without suggesting that a Harlem gangster could dictate personnel decisions in the mayor's office. Bumpy couldn't accept anything less than visible consequences without accepting that his protection of his family was conditional and negotiable. During this standoff, Bumpy made his final preparations. He assembled a team of 5 men, each chosen for specific skills and trusted completely. These weren't street thugs or hot-headed enforcers. They were professionals who understood that this operation required precision rather than violence, message sending rather than body counts. He laid out the plan in his apartment, speaking quietly while the men listened without interruption. What he described was calculated to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. It would punish Sullivan personally, without killing him. It would demonstrate Bumpy's reach and capabilities. It would send an unmistakable message to City Hall about the cost of disrespecting his family. And it would do all this while maintaining enough deniability that prosecution would be difficult even if investigators suspected Bumpy's involvement. The men asked few questions. They understood their roles, the timing, the acceptable boundaries of violence, and the absolute necessity of leaving no evidence that could connect them to Bumpy. They dispersed that evening to begin their own preparations, gathering equipment and conducting surveillance. Bumpy spent the night before the operation with Mame, talking quietly about everything except what was coming. They discussed Ruthie's future, her education, whether she might leave New York for somewhere safer. Mame knew better than to ask about his plans. She had learned decades ago that some conversations happened after events, not before them. Her job was to provide the peace he needed before doing what his reputation demanded. The morning arrived clear and cold, November wind cutting through Harlem's streets. Bumpy dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit and his best hat. He would be visible throughout the day, making sure dozens of people could place him nowhere near whatever was about to happen. His alibi would be airtight, constructed through legitimate activities witnessed by reliable people. At 10 o'clock, Bumpy sat down for breakfast at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, greeting friends and acquaintances who stopped by his table. At noon, he visited Marcus Webb's insurance office to discuss a policy, a mundane transaction that would be documented and remembered. At 2 o'clock, he attended a meeting at the Abyssinian Baptist Church with Reverend Powell to discuss a community fundraiser. While Bumpy built his alibi, his team moved into position across the city. They had 1 day to execute a plan that had taken 2 weeks to develop. The message that needed sending would be delivered before sunset, and everyone involved understood that failure wasn't acceptable. Bumpy Johnson's reputation, his family's safety, and Harlem's understanding of where real power resided all depended on what happened in the next few hours. Patrick Sullivan finished his shift at City Hall at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, the same time he finished every weekday shift. Routine made him predictable, and predictability made him vulnerable, but 6 years of uneventful security work had dulled whatever caution he once possessed. He walked to his car in the municipal parking garage, loosened his tie, and drove toward his apartment in Queens without noticing the sedan that pulled out 3 cars behind him. The drive took 40 minutes in moderate traffic. Sullivan parked on his street at 5:15, gathered his newspaper from the passenger seat, and climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment. His wife had dinner waiting, meatloaf and potatoes, and they ate while watching the evening news. Nothing about the day suggested it would be different from 1,000 other days. Nothing warned him that the disruptions of the past 2 weeks were building towards something he hadn't anticipated. At 7 o'clock, Sullivan's phone rang. The voice on the other end identified itself as Lieutenant Morrison from the mayor's office, calling about a security briefing that required his immediate attention. There had been a credible threat against the mayor. Sullivan needed to report to an address in Manhattan within the hour for an emergency meeting with the full security detail. The caller provided an address on the Lower East Side, a location Sullivan didn't immediately recognize but had no reason to question. Sullivan dressed quickly, kissing his wife and promising to return before midnight. He drove back into Manhattan, navigating to the address he'd been given. The building was a warehouse in an industrial section near the waterfront, the kind of structure that housed legitimate businesses during the day and stood empty after dark. A single light burned above a side entrance. Sullivan parked and approached cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon. The door was unlocked. Inside, a narrow hallway led to a larger room dimly lit by overhead bulbs. Sullivan called out for Lieutenant Morrison, his voice echoing off concrete walls. No response came. He moved forward, instincts finally triggering alarm, reaching for his gun. Before he could draw it, figures emerged from the shadows on either side. Hands grabbed his arms, professional and efficient. His weapon was removed before he could react. 4 men surrounded him, their faces covered with dark cloth, their movements coordinated. They forced Sullivan into a chair bolted to the floor, securing his wrists and ankles with rope that allowed no movement. He started to shout, and one of the men produced a cloth that was tied across his mouth. Not a gag that would silence him completely, but enough to muffle the curses and threats he tried to scream. No one spoke to Sullivan directly. The men worked in silence, communicating through gestures and nods. One of them set up a camera on a tripod, an expensive piece of equipment that suggested planning and resources. Another man checked his watch repeatedly, coordinating timing with precision that indicated rehearsal. At 7:45, the room's main door opened. A 5th man entered, better dressed than the others, wearing a suit that looked expensive even in the dim light. He carried a folder under his arm and walked with the confidence of someone completely in control of the situation. He positioned himself in front of Sullivan, just outside the range where the bound guard could reach him even if he broke free. The well-dressed man opened his folder and began reading aloud. He detailed every movement Sullivan had made over the past 2 weeks. The bars he visited, the woman he met on Thursday evenings while his wife believed he was working late, the illegal poker game he attended in Brooklyn, the money he'd borrowed from a loan shark to cover gambling debts his salary couldn't support. Every secret Sullivan thought he'd kept, every indiscretion he'd hidden from his employers and his family, read aloud in a calm voice that never fluctuated in tone. Then the man described Sullivan's family, his wife's name, her job at the department store, her sister who lived in New Jersey, his 2 children, their ages, their schools, their after-school activities, the route his daughter walked home each day, the park where his son played baseball on Saturday mornings. Not threats, just information, delivered with the clinical precision of an accountant reading a financial report. The man closed his folder and looked directly at Sullivan for the first time. He explained that what happened at Red Rooster had been a mistake that required correction. Sullivan had put his hands on someone he should never have touched, had disrespected a family that commanded respect regardless of what his badge told him about authority. This evening's demonstration was designed to clarify certain realities that Sullivan had failed to understand. Sullivan's hands could be reached as easily as Bumpy Johnson's daughter had been reached. His children walked streets that weren't as safe as he assumed. His secrets were known to people who could destroy his marriage, his career, and his freedom with a few phone calls to the right authorities. The power he believed his position granted him was conditional and limited, effective only within boundaries he had violated. The man returned the folder to his briefcase and checked his watch. The camera had been recording everything, he explained. The footage would be kept as insurance against future misunderstandings. If Sullivan or any member of the mayor's security detail ever approached Bumpy Johnson's family again, if they ever forgot the lessons of this evening, the recording would be delivered to people who would find it very interesting. Internal affairs investigators, newspaper reporters, Sullivan's wife, whoever would cause maximum damage. Two of the masked men approached Sullivan with a set of professional barber's tools. They cut his hair, not violently but thoroughly, shearing it down to uneven patches that left him looking disheveled and humiliated. They removed his jacket, his tie, his shoes, leaving him bound to the chair in his shirt and socks. Then they photographed him from multiple angles, the camera flash illuminating his face twisted with rage and fear. The well-dressed man delivered his final message. Sullivan would be released in 2 hours, left with enough time to make it home before his wife began to worry seriously. He would tell no one about this evening, would file no police report, would not seek revenge or retaliation. Any attempt to identify or prosecute the men in this room would result in the immediate release of the video recording and photographic evidence. Sullivan's cooperation in forgetting this night ever happened was the price of keeping his secrets buried. The men filed out systematically, taking the camera equipment and leaving Sullivan alone in the warehouse. True to their word, someone returned at 10 o'clock to cut the ropes binding him to the chair. By the time Sullivan freed himself completely and reached the door, the building stood empty. His car remained where he'd parked it, his weapon placed on the driver's seat, his wallet and badge untouched. Sullivan drove home in silence, his butchered hair and missing clothes requiring explanation to his wife. He told her he'd been mugged, a story that raised questions he deflected with manufactured anger and exhaustion. He called in sick the next morning, spending 3 days at home before returning to work wearing a hat that covered his poorly shaved head. The other guards on the mayor's security detail received their own messages, less dramatic but equally clear. Photographs of their homes appeared in their mailboxes, taken from angles that suggested surveillance they hadn't noticed. Their personal phone numbers, known only to family and close friends, received calls from strangers who hung up without speaking. Small violations of their privacy that announced someone was watching. Someone knew where they lived and how to reach them. Word of Sullivan's incident spread through City Hall within days, carried by whispers and speculation rather than official reports. The story grew in the telling, details added or embellished, but the core message remained consistent. Sullivan had experienced consequences for the restaurant incident, consequences that bypassed official channels and demonstrated reach that city employment couldn't prevent. Mayor Wagner received his own message through the city councilman who'd been facilitating communication. Bumpy Johnson considered the matter with his daughter resolved through personal channels. Future cooperation with the mayor's office would continue under the previous arrangement, provided certain boundaries were respected going forward. The message carried the implicit understanding that violations would be addressed through similar personal channels rather than official complaints. Wagner recognized he'd lost this particular confrontation. Sullivan remained employed, but his effectiveness as a security guard was compromised by the knowledge that his protection had limits. The mayor's authority in Harlem had been checked by a demonstration of alternative power that his office couldn't prevent or prosecute. The arrangement between City Hall and Bumpy Johnson continued, but the balance had shifted slightly in Bumpy's favor. Harlem absorbed the story of Sullivan's comeuppance with satisfaction that spread through barbershops, beauty salons, and street corners. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the conclusion remained the same. Bumpy Johnson had protected his family, had demonstrated that respect meant something regardless of who wore a badge or claimed official authority. The neighborhood's understanding of power was reinforced. Real protection came from community strength rather than government institutions. Ruthie returned to Harlem 2 weeks after the warehouse incident, moving back into her apartment without fanfare. She received no apology from Sullivan or the mayor's office, no official acknowledgement that she'd been wronged, but she noticed the difference in how she was treated in public spaces, the extra deference from service staff, the way certain people avoided even incidental contact with her. Word had spread about what happened when someone disrespected Bumpy Johnson's daughter, and Harlem remembered. Bumpy himself never spoke publicly about the revenge he'd orchestrated. When associates mentioned the Sullivan incident in conversation, he changed the subject or responded with noncommittal silence. His alibi for that evening remained airtight, documented and witnessed. No evidence connected him to the warehouse, the phone call that lured Sullivan to the location, or the men who delivered the message. He had achieved his objective while maintaining the deniability that kept federal investigators from justifying an intervention. The arrangement worked because everyone involved understood what was actually happening beneath the surface. Sullivan knew who had orchestrated his humiliation, but couldn't prove it or seek official recourse without destroying himself. Wagner knew Bumpy had sent an unmistakable message about boundaries and consequences. The people of Harlem knew that one of their own had stood up to City Hall's arrogance and won. The truth existed in what wasn't said, in the silences and implications that carried more weight than any official statement. The incident at Red Rooster and its aftermath became part of Harlem's oral history, a story repeated and embellished over the decades that followed. The details shifted depending on who told it, but the central truth remained constant. Bumpy Johnson had defended his family against an abuse of power, and he'd done it in a way that reminded everyone where real authority resided in the neighborhood. For Sullivan, the consequences extended beyond a single humiliating evening. His effectiveness as a security guard diminished after word spread about the warehouse incident. Fellow officers questioned whether he could be trusted in dangerous situations, whether the fear he'd experienced had broken something essential. Within a year, he transferred to a desk position, citing health concerns. He retired early from city service in 1965, his career trajectory permanently altered by the choice he'd made to grab a young woman in a Harlem restaurant. The mayor's office adjusted its approach to Harlem affairs following the incident. Wagner's security detail received new instructions about showing restraint in predominantly black neighborhoods, about clearing rooms with more discretion. The changes weren't announced publicly or documented in official policy, but guards understood that certain families commanded respect regardless of what their badges might suggest about authority. The arrangement between City Hall and Bumpy's organization continued, now reinforced by a clearer understanding of consequences. Bumpy Johnson lived 7 more years after the restaurant incident, dying of congestive heart failure in 1968. His death marked the end of an era in Harlem, the loss of a figure who had navigated the dangerous intersection of crime, politics, and community protection for 4 decades. Thousands attended his funeral, a mix of criminals, legitimate business people, politicians, and ordinary residents, who recognized that Harlem was losing something irreplaceable. The story of how he'd handled Sullivan's disrespect was told at his funeral and in the tributes that followed. It became emblematic of Bumpy's approach to power, his ability to respond to provocations with calculated precision rather than impulsive violence. People remembered it as proof that respect mattered, that family was sacred, and that authority meant nothing without the character to wield it responsibly. The incident crystallized Bumpy's legacy as a protector who understood that real power came from the community's recognition of your willingness to stand up for them. Ruthie Johnson carried the memory of that evening for the rest of her life. In interviews conducted decades later, she spoke carefully about her father, acknowledging his criminal activities while defending his role as a community figure. She rarely discussed the restaurant incident in detail, but when pressed, she described it as a defining moment in understanding both the vulnerability and the protection that came with being Bumpy Johnson's daughter. The experience shaped her perspective on power, respect, and the complicated relationship between black communities and the authorities meant to serve them. The legacy of that November evening in 1962 extended beyond the individuals directly involved. It became a reference point in Harlem for discussions about dignity, resistance, and the limits of official authority. When residents faced abuses from police or city officials in subsequent years, the story of Bumpy and Sullivan was invoked as evidence that power could be challenged. That disrespect didn't have to be accepted silently. The incident fed into the broader civil rights consciousness emerging in black communities across America, demonstrating that respect had to be demanded and defended, not simply requested from those who held institutional power. In the decades since Bumpy Johnson's death, the Red Rooster incident has been referenced in books, documentaries, and dramatic retellings of his life. Some versions exaggerate the revenge, turning it into violent retribution that never actually occurred. Others sanitize the story, removing the criminal context and presenting Bumpy as simply a civil rights figure. The truth exists somewhere between these extremes, in the complicated reality of a man who broke laws while enforcing a moral code, who ran criminal operations while protecting his community, who responded to his daughter's humiliation with calculated precision that achieved its objective without unnecessary bloodshed. The story endures because it captures something fundamental about power, respect, and the social contracts that exist beneath official structures. It demonstrates that authority without accountability invites resistance, that protecting family transcends legal considerations, and that dignity matters enough to risk everything defending it. Sullivan learned these lessons in a warehouse on the Lower East Side. Harlem already knew them, but appreciated watching someone like Bumpy Johnson teach them to people who'd forgotten that badges and political connections have limits. What happened at Red Rooster in 1962 wasn't just about one man's revenge for a personal slight. It was about boundaries between communities and the authorities that governed them, about the price of disrespect in a neighborhood that had suffered too much of it, and about a father's willingness to risk his freedom to protect his daughter's dignity. The incident became legend because it represented resistance that succeeded, power that defended rather than exploited, and justice that existed outside courtrooms and official channels. Bumpy Johnson's response to Sullivan's actions reminded everyone watching that real power isn't granted by institutions. It's earned through respect, protected through strength, and measured by your willingness to act when the people you love are threatened.